Did Nero know he created Star Trek's Kelvin timeline? Nero, Eric Bana, was the villain in J.J. Abrams' Star Trek 2009, but the vengeful Romulan didn't understand that he created and was living in a new alternate reality. J.J. Abrams rebooted the Star Trek movies into a summer blockbuster franchise, and he successfully recast the iconic characters from Star Trek, the original series, with young actors. Nero, however, was a brand new villain created for Star Trek 2009. No other antagonist would instigate such a drastic change to Star Trek, even if Nero didn't fully understand the ramifications of his actions. Nero hails from the 24th century of Star Trek's prime timeline. In the 2380s, the Romulan sun went supernova. Ambassador Spock, Leonard Nimoy, pledged to save the Romulan homeworld, but his experiment to use red matter to counter the supernova failed. Aboard his mining starship, the Narada, Nero watched in agony as his planet and people, including his beloved wife, perished. However, Nero's Narada and Spock, aboard his starship, the Jellyfish, were pulled into the supernova's event horizon, and both emerged in the 23rd century, albeit 25 years apart. Nero then committed the evil act that sent J.J. Abrams' Star Trek movies in an entirely new direction. Why Nero didn't know he created Star Trek 2009's alternate Kelvin timeline when the Narada emerged in 2233 at the start of Star Trek 2009. Nero ordered the destruction of the U.S. as Kelvin, the Starfleet ship that intercepted the unknown time-traveling vessel. Nero destroying the Kelvin with Lt. George Kirk, Chris Hemsworth, the father of Captain James T. Kirk, Chris Pine aboard, created a new timeline with new events and altered the destinies of billions of people, including Captain Kirk, Spock, Zachary Quinto, and the crew of the USS Enterprise. But Nero did not seem to understand that he spawned and was living in an alternate reality in Star Trek 2009. When Nero captured Captain Christopher Pike, Bruce Greenwood, the Romulan explained he planned to destroy every member world of the United Federation of Planets. In Nero's mind, if there is no Federation, then Romulus will never be destroyed in the 24th century. From the way Nero threatened Pike, the Romulan believed his plan would save his homeworld in the 24th century, but the Romulus he knew no longer existed. On the Starship Enterprise, Spock deduced that Nero destroying the USS Kelvin in 2233 created a new alternate reality where events can't be predicted by either party. But by his actions, Nero believed he was still in the prime timeline and fighting to preserve the Romulus he remembered while punishing Ambassador Spock and the Federation. What differences did Nero create between Star Trek's prime and Kelvin timelines? The changes Nero caused because of his destruction of the USS Kelvin are incalculable, but every character in Star Trek 2009 was affected. James T. Kirk grew up without a father, which delayed his enlistment into Starfleet. However, once aboard the Enterprise, Kirk rocketed to the captain's chair during the campaign to stop Nero. Spock suffered through the destruction of his homeworld of Vulcan and the death of his mother, Amanda Grayson, Winona Ryder, all caused by Nero's revenge. Countless changes, from Spock dating Lt. Nyota Uhura Zoe Saldana to Ambassador Spock giving Scotty Simon Pegg his own future invention of transwarp beaming, stemmed from Nero. The Kelvin timeline in the Star Trek universe begins with the arrival of the Romulan miner, Nero, from the future. This altered timeline has fascinated fans since it was introduced in the 2009 Star Trek film, directed by J.J. Abrams. But a curious question arises. Did Nero, the vengeful Romulan, understand that his actions were birthing an entirely new Star Trek universe, a timeline that would become known as the Kelvin timeline? To answer this question, we first need to examine Nero's motivations and what led him to the past. Nero was a Romulan miner whose homeworld, Romulus, was destroyed by a supernova in the late 24th century. According to the original Star Trek timeline Prime Universe, this event occurred after the adventures of the Next Generation era. Spock, attempting to prevent the catastrophe, created a black hole to contain the supernova's destruction, but the effort failed. The collapse resulted in both Spock and Nero being pulled into the black hole and thrown into the past. This accidental trip to the year 2233 is crucial because it marks the point at which the Kelvin timeline diverges from the original Prime universe. Nero's Romulan ship, the Narada, emerges in this past era and immediately encounters the USS Kelvin, captained by George Kirk, the father of James T. Kirk. The encounter ends with the destruction of the Kelvin and George Kirk's heroic sacrifice to save his crew. Nero's arrival in the past, his first significant act, already signals a massive divergence from the Prime universe. In the original timeline, Kirk's father lived, influencing Kirk's upbringing and career trajectory. However, in the Kelvin timeline, George Kirk dies, leaving James T. Kirk with a different path that shapes his future as the daring, rule-breaking captain we see in the 2009 film. This moment is the inception of the Kelvin timeline, a new alternate reality. But would Nero have known that his actions were altering the course of history? Nero's primary objective was revenge. He held Spock responsible for Romulus's destruction and was focused on punishing the Federation, believing it was indirectly responsible for the suffering of his people. His single-minded pursuit of vengeance likely clouded any deeper understanding of the consequences of his time travel. Nero did not seem to be a scientist or someone deeply concerned with the theoretical aspects of time travel or multiverse theory. His actions were driven by raw emotion, grief, and anger over the loss of his world and his family. To Nero, his trip to the past was less about creating alternate realities and more about taking control of his destiny by erasing what he viewed as the root cause of Romulus's destruction, the Federation and Spock. That said, Nero may have had some rudimentary understanding that his actions would have profound effects on the timeline. After all, he was aware that by destroying Federation planets and ships, like the Kelvin and eventually Vulcan, he was altering the course of history. But it's important to recognize that he likely did not know or care that his actions were spawning an alternate timeline distinct from the Prime universe. His focus was revenge, not quantum mechanics. In the broader scope of Star Trek canon, time travel has often been depicted as having the potential to create alternate timelines, even if the characters themselves are not always aware of the full ramifications. From episodes like The City on the Edge of Forever in the original series to All Good Things. In The Next Generation, the idea of alternate realities has been woven into the franchise. However, the Kelvin timeline is unique in that it explicitly establishes a parallel universe created by Nero's incursion, coexisting alongside the Prime universe rather than overriding it. Thus, while Nero's actions in 2233 directly caused the branching of the Kelvin timeline, it is unlikely that he had a full grasp of the fact that he was creating a new alternate reality. His knowledge of time travel and its effects was probably superficial at best. He understood that he was changing the past, but not that he was generating a distinct parallel universe. In fact, in his mind, Nero was rewriting the Federation's history to serve his desire for revenge, not intentionally creating a new timeline for future generations to explore. Ironically, Nero's lack of understanding about the broader implications of his actions paved the way for a whole new generation of Star Trek stories. The Kelvin timeline, named after the ship that was destroyed during his arrival, has allowed the Star Trek franchise to expand, creating new adventures and interpretations of familiar characters like Kirk, Spock, and Uhura, while leaving the original Prime universe intact. Nero's personal tragedy and his vengeful journey became the catalyst for a fresh take on Star Trek, even if he himself never knew the significance of what he had done. In the end, Nero was merely the spark that ignited the Kelvin timeline, a man driven by rage and grief, not a master architect of parallel universes. His actions altered history in profound ways, but whether or not he understood the full scope of what he had done is doubtful. In his quest for revenge, Nero unknowingly reshaped the future of Star Trek itself.